Thank you all for joining us this evening. We'll get started promptly at 6:30 p.m. Thanks again for joining us this evening. We'll get started promptly at 6:30 p.m. Thank you for joining us this evening. If you're joining us a couple of minutes early, we'll get started promptly at 6:30 p.m. Thanks so much. Okay, it is 6:30 p.m., so let's begin. Good evening, everyone. I'm Emily Waddell with the Harris County Flood Control District's communications team. Welcome to tonight's conversation. The purpose of this meeting is to inform you about a possible flood mitigation project along Little White Oak Bayou and a federal grant administered through the Texas General Land Office that could help us fund it. I'm joined tonight by a team of Flood Control District leadership and subject matter experts to ensure we keep you up to date on these important flood mitigation projects in your community. There are two ways to participate in tonight's meeting. The first is via phone by calling 855-925 2801 utilizing meeting code 8057, or you can join us online at publicinput.com/Little White Oak. Please note that if you're joining tonight's session via phone, you will not be able to see the presentation, maps, or exhibits. Those items are available on the meeting website in English and in Spanish. Visit publicinput.com/Little White Oak to access them. And while you're joining us this evening, there are 3 ways to submit about this project during tonight's session. You can submit a comment on this site in the box next to the presentation live stream. You can also submit a comment on the Flood Control District's website at hcfcd.org/Little White Oak. Finally, if you're joining us via phone this evening, please press *3 to leave a message. Any questions not addressed during tonight's question and answer session will receive a response after the event. After this meeting concludes, a recording of tonight's program and the presentation will be posted to the Little White Oak Bayou page of the Flood Control District website. And again, that URL is hcfcd.org/Little White Oak. We'll now read these instructions in Spanish for anyone who may be joining us.
Por teléfono. Hay 2 formas de participar en la reunión de esta noche. Por teléfono llamando al 855-925-2801 con el código de reunión 8057 o en línea en publicinput.com /Little White Oak. Tengan en cuenta que si se unen a la sesión de hoy por teléfono, no podrán ver la presentación, las mapas ni la documentación. Esos elementos están disponibles en inglés y en español en el sitio web de la reunión. Ingresen a publicinput.com /Little White Oak para tener acceso a ellos. Existen 3 maneras de enviar un comentario sobre este proyecto durante la sesión de esta noche. La primera, pueden enviar un comentario en este sitio en el cuadro junto a la transmisión en vivo. 2, también pueden enviar un comentario en el sitio web de control de inundaciones en hcfcd.org /Little White Oak. Y por último, si nos acompañan por teléfono, presione *3 para dejar un mensaje. Las preguntas que no se aborden durante la sesión de preguntas y respuestas de esta noche se responderán después del evento. Una vez que finalice esta reunión, se publicará la grabación del programa y la presentación de esta noche en el sitio web de Little White Oak Bayou en www.hcfcd.org /Little White Oak.
Thank you, Jorge. We'll begin tonight's meeting with a brief presentation about the flood mitigation project we're investigating. This will be followed by a moderated question and answer session where you'll have a chance to participate. To kick off the conversation, I'd like to introduce Alan Black, Director of Operations with the Flood Control District. Alan, over to you.
Well, thanks, Emily, and thanks again to everyone for joining us this evening. As Emily mentioned, we're here this evening to talk about an exciting opportunity to apply for a federal grant through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD, to construct flood damage reduction projects in your community. The grants are called Community Development Block Grants for Mitigation, or CDBG-MIT for short. Now, for those of you following along with the PDF via phone, we're moving to slide 6 of tonight's presentation.
Para quienes siguen el PDF por teléfono, vamos a pasar a la diapositiva 6 de la presentación de esta noche.
So before we get into specifics, let's set the stage. You may remember the 2018 bond election when Harris County voters overwhelmingly approved dollars to fund flood risk mitigation projects across the county. Since the bond's passing, we have initiated 144 of the 181 projects across all watersheds, with 38 of those projects added based directly on input from you, the community. And while the bond was for $2.5 billion, The full cost of every project in the bond table is almost $5 billion. So we made it clear from the outset that we would need funding partners to fully construct the projects on the list. Without partnership funding, every project would still be started, but we may have to phase some of the work until additional funds become available. So that's where tonight's conversation comes in. Partnership funding is a vital aspect of the 2018 bond program, and we are committed to exploring all opportunities of additional funding to further these projects across the region. The Flood Control District works continuously to identify potential funding programs, and many of those programs are shown here in what I like to call the spaghetti model of federal funding. The federal government doesn't just write us a big fat check and say, go do good work. Instead, they appropriate funding into these various programs. We then match our proposed projects to various program requirements, and I should say those requirements are very different from one program to another. So we apply for, advocate for, and often compete against other projects for a limited available funds. The funding source we will be discussing tonight during this session, the CDBG-MIT program, is noted on the screen with a yellow arrow. Now, CDBG-MIT funding is administered at the state level by the Texas General Land Office, or GLO. And tonight, we're reaching out for your feedback on applications we plan to submit to them. These funds are designated for mitigation activities, which are the types of projects we prioritize at the Flood Control District every day. Activities that increase resilience and help reduce long-term risks for the community. So our applications are due by the end of October, and it's important to note that there are no guarantees we will be successful. But again, we are committed to bringing as much federal funding as possible to the county. And I want to emphasize that tonight's meeting is not the only time you're going to hear from the Flood Control District on this project. Some of you may have joined us back on September 9th, and that will continue. With or without CDBG-MIT funds, we'll be coming back to the community to share updates as these projects move forward into the preliminary engineering and design, including more information about specific plans, exhibits, and timelines. So you can think of tonight's discussion as a high-level preview of that effort. We have been tracking this funding since it was approved by Congress more than 2 years ago as part of the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2018. In total, more than $4 billion was allocated to the state of Texas. And after navigating the lengthy federal and state processes, those funds are finally now available for entities across the entire state to apply for, including Harris County and the Harris County Flood Control District. As you can see on this slide, we are currently in the community outreach phase, seeking feedback on proposed projects, and early next month, the draft applications themselves. Applications are due on October 28th of 2020. Here, you will see an overview of all of the projects included in our multiple CDBG-MIT applications, which will include the one that we're discussing tonight. That's the larger star right in the middle of the screen. We're hosting these meetings across the county to discuss the projects, gather feedback from residents, and continue the conversation about funding flood risk mitigation efforts across our region. So with that, I'd now like to introduce Burton Johnston, who will be discussing the specific project we're focusing on this evening. Burton, over to you.
For those of you following along with the PDF via phone, we're moving to slide 11 of tonight's presentation.
Para quienes siguen el PDF por teléfono, vamos a pasar a la diapositiva 11 de la presentación de esta noche.
All right, thank you, Alan. I'm going to talk a little bit about the project that Alan referred to, the project that we are planning to include in a request for federal funding. Well, that is the focus of tonight's meeting. For context, I would like to first talk about our ongoing master plan development for the entire Little White Oak Bayou subwatershed. Little White Oak Bayou flows north to south for approximately 12 miles from near the Acres Home neighborhood downstream to its confluence with White Oak Bayou just north of downtown. A total of 22 square miles of area ultimately drains into Little White Oak Bayou, primarily through a network of open channels and underground stormwater pipes. We refer to this area as the Little White Oak Bayou Subwatershed. The sub in Subwatershed because Little White Oak Bayou is part of the larger White Oak Bayou watershed. I'd like to walk you up the bayou, so to speak, and introduce some of the projects that have been constructed by the Flood Control District in the past. To do this, I've broken down the bayou into 4 segments, which us drainage people refer to as reaches. And I'm going to work from downstream to upstream. Reach 1, bottom of this slide, runs from the confluence with White Oak Bayou north of I-610 to north of I-610, the North Loop. The reach of the bayou remains in a mostly natural state and is quite deep when compared to the rest of the bayou. This portion of the bayou has a higher capacity to carry water than the other portions of the watershed. Moving north, or up in this case, is Reach 2, which is located between the North Loop and Victoria Street. This reach includes a long culvert running underneath I-610, which is within the Texas Department of Transportation's right-of-way. This culvert is not as large as it needs to be and restricts the flow of Little White Oak Bayou. Just upstream of the North Loop, the bayou is a stable natural channel, but after it passes the railroad a few blocks north, the channel is concrete lined. The Flood Control District constructed this concrete lining in the late 1970s. Continuing upstream, Reach 3 extends between Victoria Street and Yale Street. This portion was also concrete lined in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. Reach 4 is the most upstream portion, extending upstream from Yale and beyond North Shepherd Drive. Much of this reach is man-made, as the natural channel did not extend all the way upstream. At the very most upstream portions, the channel actually looks like a small ditch. There is no concrete lining in this segment, as the concrete lining terminates at Yale. Flooding has been observed along all 4 reaches, but the flooding is much worse along the 3 upstream reaches, or reaches 2, 3, and 4. The cause of this is simply that there is too much water for the channel to handle, and further, there are restrictions from culverts, such as the one I previously mentioned at the North Loop. What we're looking at now is the FEMA effective floodplain map. This map correctly illustrates the flooding in the upper 3 reaches. The map on the right also includes observed flooding in the past 5 years, although we removed the Harvey flooding because it was just so widespread. The flooding areas are the red dots shown on the map. The dark blue indicates the FEMA 100-year floodplain, while the light blue indicates the 500-year floodplain. You'll notice that there is a large number of red dots along the bayou, as you would expect. But you may also have noticed that there are many red dots a long way from the bayou. Why is that? The storm pipes and channels that carry water from the neighborhoods to the channel, which we often call the lateral system, are also undersized. Further, when water levels in Little White Oak Bayou are high, they are not as able to see flow from these lateral systems. It is important to keep in mind that when creating these flood maps, FEMA only considers flooding caused by Little White Oak Bayou leaving its banks and does not consider potential flooding from the lateral systems. This slide depicts the main arteries of this lateral system. The purple or magenta lines indicate the major underground storm pipes, which are generally within the City of Houston right-of-way, while the green lines are open channels, which are usually within the Harris County Flood Control District's right-of-way. So for our Little White Oak Bayou Subwatershed Master Plan, we are interested in both the Little White Oak Bayou as well as the lateral systems, and particularly we are interested in how they interact. So we built a new model which includes both. When we put these features in our modeling, we get a better overall picture of flooding throughout the subwatershed that mostly closely aligns with observed flooding in areas away from the bayou itself. And I must add that the model we're depicting here is a work in progress and not finalized, so we have it labeled as preliminary. The model also allows us to develop more comprehensive flood risk reduction plans that benefit the entire subwatershed, including those lateral areas away from the bayou. Where are we in the development of this master plan? We expect to have this master plan completed in early 2021. We'll have additional public engagements to talk specifically about this plan. The master plan will outline multiple projects the flood control district and others can undertake to address flooding throughout the watershed. This will necessarily include coordination with other jurisdictions, such as the City of Houston, to fully implement. Overall, we estimate it would cost several $100 million or more to implement the master plan. However, the Harris County Flood Control District 2018 bond only allocated $30 million for projects in the Little White Oak Bayou subwatershed. So where will the remaining funds come from? The Flood Control District looks for partnership opportunities with various entities to help fund individual projects. And typically this happens after we complete a master plan similar to the one I have introduced to you here. Now I'm going to get into the second part of the conversation. And this is really what we're here to talk about today. For those of you following along with the PDF via phone, we're moving to slide 17 of tonight's presentation.
Ahora voy a pasar a la segunda parte de nuestra conversación. Para quienes siguen el PDF por teléfono, vamos a pasar a la diapositiva 17 de la presentación de esta noche.
As Alan mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we have an opportunity right now to apply for federal grant for a project we believe is a good candidate for funding. So we're going a little bit out of order from our usual process, frankly, because we must be aggressive and opportunistic in our pursuit of federal funding and partnerships. The project that we're looking at is along Little White Oak Bayou between Cross Timber Street to the south and Tidwell Road to the north, and generally between the North Freeway to the east and Yale to the west. The project area is shown on this map. Take a look at the illustration on your screen and keep in mind this is for illustrative purposes only and is not meant to represent the actual design of the project. In the grant application, we are proposing a couple of things. One is what you see here, widening Little White Oak Bayou, which would also entail removing the concrete lining. The primary benefit of widening the bayou is that it increases the channel's carrying capacity, meaning it can hold more water and move more water downstream. The area adjacent to the project's footprint, for the area adjacent to the project's footprint, there would be a substantial reduction in flood risk. The second part of the project proposal is adding stormwater detention to hold all the excess stormwater until it can safely make its way back into the bayou. This allows us to build the project without increasing flow rates to the neighbors downstream and actually benefits the entire watershed because we remove excess capacity from the bayou and allow the lateral drainage system, the storm pipes and open channels to function better. In essence, we are trying to find a place to put all the excess stormwater that is currently in neighborhood streets and even homes, and the stormwater basins provide that place. I mentioned substantial. What does that mean? Our analysis indicates that during the largest floods, including a Harvey level type event, the channel and detention will hold most of the floodwaters. And while we can't rule out the potential for flooding to still occur, both the area impacted by floodwater and the depth of the flooding would be much, much less. We estimate that this project I just described will cost $78 million. Recall, the 2018 bond only allocated $30 million for Little White Oak Bayou. As part of our grant application, we are requesting $68 million in funding from the federal government to help us construct this project. The remaining $10 million will come from the 2018 bond allocation. And even if we are successful in obtaining grant funding for the project, there are still several more steps we need to complete. The life cycle of an individual project starts with the feasibility study. That's the phase we're in now. Funding, the project is more fully developed and any environmental clearance is obtained. We then acquire the needed right-of-way and relocate utility lines if needed. The final three stages are design, construction, and then operation and maintenance. We estimate it would take 3 to 4 years to move through the pre-construction steps. If we do not receive grant funding for the project, then the timing of the project is uncertain and the life cycle is extended. This illustrates the importance and urgency of this grant opportunity. Thank you for your time, and I'll pass this back to Emily.
Thanks so much, Burton. As we've discussed, the Flood Control District would like to prepare and submit an application for grant funds to help build flood damage reduction projects in your community. But even if we're not selected, as Burton mentioned, we'll be moving forward with the process. Alan, Burton, and several other experts from the Flood Control District are joining us again for a question and answer session. But before we open it up to your questions, I wanted to share a quick reminder of the 3 ways to submit a comment or a question about this project during tonight's session. You can submit a comment on this site in the box next to the presentation live stream. You can also submit a comment on the Flood Control District website at hcfcd.org/Little White Oak. And finally, if you're joining us via phone this evening, a quick reminder to please press *3 to leave a message. Any questions not addressed during tonight's question and answer session will receive a response after the event. Now, let's open the floor to your questions. Our first question comes from Brian G, and this one will go to Alan. So Alan, Brian has lived next to Little White Oak Bayou at Riggs Road for many years. It seems that lately the rain gauges will show lower amounts of rainfall, but the channel will still go out of banks. Is there a reason that could happen? Could you speak to that?
Sure. It's hard for me to speculate on the specific location you're talking about because there could be a lot of different things going on there, but I'll talk through them briefly. First and foremost, there could be that there is some sort of blockage out there. We make a point of inspecting all of our channels on a regular basis, but if perhaps we've missed something out there, we'll certainly take the opportunity to send somebody out there and take a look. But I also want to emphasize that sometimes water gets out of banks because there are blockages that happen right off on the spur. So if wind comes along and knocks something down and the water starts getting blocked up, you need to let us know about that. And so please go to our website at hcfcd.org and you can submit that problem to us and we'll go out and take a look quickly.
Thanks, Alan. Dean, our next question is also from Brian G, and this is going to come to you. He says there's plenty of vacant land directly next to the bayou, as well as buildings that could potentially be torn down and used for overflow and retention. Can you talk about whether or not this is being considered?
Sure. Well, right now, as Burton pointed out earlier, we're still in that feasibility or planning stage for this CDBG-MIT project. Once we wrap up some additional detail for that, we'll have a better idea of what the specific right-of-way needs will be. We'll certainly try to work within the right-of-way that flood control owns already. And if we do need to purchase additional right-of-way, we'd certainly try to minimize that or do that in a way that minimizes impact on a community. So we don't have the specifics laid out, but that's something we'll keep in mind as we move forward with this project.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Dina. Burton, our next question is going to come to you, and it's from Mr. Branch. He asks if anything is going to be done immediately to help Independence Heights on flooding issues.
I think the word in there is immediately. So let me answer this way. We're very aware of the issues of Independence Heights. When you talk about flooding on Little White Oak Bayou, there is a couple of places you think of first, and Independence Heights is certainly one of those. When it comes to the CDBG-MIT grant application that we're talking about today, there will be detention in part of the project upstream that will provide some benefit in Independence Heights, but not a whole lot. The real benefit in Independence Heights will come with the removal of the culvert underneath 610, which is really the beginning of the problem in that area. Our understanding and our coordination with TxDOT is that as part of their project, they intend to remove that culvert and replace it with a bridge. And that will go a long way of reducing flooding between the loop and Cross Timbers, which is Independence Heights. And it's difficult to do that, do a whole lot there until that happens. And so connecting the word immediately, we start to look at what would TxDOT's schedule would be if their project goes forward. And that's the timeline on that.
Emily, I'd like to add a little bit to that if I could.
Absolutely.
So there was one point I actually missed when I was responding to Brian G's comment earlier. He mentioned that he is near the Riggs Road. That is one of the areas where flood control recently acquired property, the old Northline apartments. We bought those and demolished them. And opportunities like that, where we've now got some property right on the bayou, we are implementing small scale excavation projects that you should start seeing in over the next couple of months to 6 to 8 months, where we'll get out there. We know eventually we're going to need a hole in the ground. And so there are some opportunities where we can start those now. And so while that isn't, the big vision, the big master plan that we ultimately want to do, we can at least start to get some good work done out there. And that Riggs area is a really good example of it. Thanks.
Thanks, Alan. And Alan, I'm actually going to stick with you for our next question, which comes in from Ken G. He says the properties on the east end near Janish between Shepherd and Yale have come close to flooding a few times in the past 3 years due to overwhelmed drains. Now there are multi-unit properties going in on a single block. Can you talk about what is being done to mitigate the excess drainage from those properties? And is it the flood control district that issues those types of permits?
So I'll respond to this in reverse order. First, about the agency that issues these types of permits. That is going to be the City of Houston. However, we work very closely with the City of Houston, and whenever there's work that is going to have any bearing or impact on flood controls right of way, such as in Little White Oak, they coordinate with us. So now the question is, what is being done to oversee development in the area? Well, we live in what's considered or what's called a no-rise community. And so what that means is that any development that occurs has to prove to the regulating agency, in this case, it's the City of Houston, has to prove that they are not causing an impact. And often that comes in the form of some kind of detention. That isn't always a big hole in the ground that everybody can see from the road. Sometimes developers choose to use underground detention because they're not making any more property out here and land isn't cheap. And so sometimes they choose to do underground detention in the form of large pipes. I'm not saying that is or isn't what happened for the development in that particular area, but those are some of the techniques that can be used. But rest assured that development activity is monitored and they are required to prove that they're not causing an impact before they move forward with their development.
Thanks, Alan. That's helpful clarification. Burton, I'm going to come to you with our next question, which actually came in via voicemail. Someone is asking if we'll be constructing this project potentially in phases. Can you help to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. And I want to differentiate between the suite of projects that will be developed as part of the master plan, which most definitely will come to online through phases over many, many years as funding becomes available. But specifically the CDBG-MIT project that we're talking about today, the one between Cross Timbers and Tidwell, that will be built when funding's received. It will be built very quickly in one initiative. So phases is kind of a tricky word. There's a sequence that projects have to go through. For example, we have to build the detention before we widen the channel. We would have to adjust or reconstruct bridges before we would widen the channel. So all of those things would happen in the right order. I don't know if I would particularly call those phases. It would really be built once funding is received in pretty short order.
Thanks, Burton. That's helpful clarification. We are getting a lot of great questions this evening, some of which are about very specific issues in the community, which we of course welcome. Tonight's session is focused on this particular identified project, excuse me, bit of a mouthful, and the potential grant application that we're hoping to submit. So we will be following up with everyone after the event with responses to questions and with inquiries. I just want to rest assured that we'll be getting back to you, but we do want to keep tonight's focus tonight's conversation as focused as we can. So one of the questions that we received from Mrs. Harrell is how she can get a copy of this presentation. I do want to reiterate that all of the materials we're sharing tonight, the slides, the exhibits, all of that, including a recording of tonight's session, will be available on the Flood Control District's website. And again, that URL is hcfcd.org/Little White Oak. That should be there in the next 24 hours. Burton, our next question is going to come to you. We had a question asking if we are trying to rebuild the bayou. Can you speak to that a little bit and perhaps clarify?
I've never thought of it in those terms exactly, but in essence, that is what we'd be doing through the particular project REACH, where we would be constructing a channel that would look and perform quite a bit different than the one we see today. Instead of concrete, you'd see grass. Instead of steep slopes, you'd see gradual slopes. Instead of something that you probably want to hide and not look at, you might have something that you might like to look at and enjoy. So I've never thought of it as rebuilding the bayou per se, but that's probably what it is in that particular REACH.
Great. Thanks so much for that clarification, Burton. Dina, I'm going to come to you for our next question, which is from Ken G, and I think it's a really good one. Can you, he's asking, without the concrete lining, what will keep the newly developed bayou from major erosion problems?
Okay, great. Well, actually, Burton just touched on some of that. When we go in and design the channel to be constructed, we'll gather a lot of information about the soil properties, about the flows that will be carried by the channel, and then come up with a design that will help carry those flows, but also protect it so that it doesn't have erosion once it's been constructed. So a lot of times that can be the types of plants you put along the embankment. Burton mentioned we often will use a grass-lined channel with a more gentle side slope instead of a very steep embankment. But we also can put different types of plantings in along the channel as well, things that will really help protect it and let it hold up as it's carrying those flows down through the channel.
Thanks, Dina. That's a great answer. Our next question is going to come to Alan, and it really gets to the heart of why we're here tonight. Mrs. DeBose is asking what the difference is between specific flood mitigation funds and these CDBG-MIT funds. Alan, can you speak to that?
Sure, and another really good question. I'll start by illustrating the bond funds. So Harris County voters approved bond funds for these projects. And so in the Little White Oak Bayou watershed, that means that flood control has $30 million to spend in the Little White Oak Bayou watershed. Now, Burton has also talked about a much bigger need in that watershed that goes well beyond $30 million. And so what we can, on the first part, the flood mitigation funds, those are the bond funds that have been approved by voters, and we are anticipating spending those in the Little White Oak Bayou. Those CDBG funds are, I use an expression, other people's money. It's a way to plus up the money we've already committed. We've put our local skin in the game. We're putting our local money on the table and saying, we're ready to spend this. Federal government, we'd like you to spend some money as well because we all pay our federal taxes. So that's kind of the difference between the local flood mitigation funds. Those are the funds that come from your property taxes and come from were approved through the bond election. But the CDBG funds are coming from the federal government. I hope that helps.
Really helpful, Alan. Thanks so much. Okay, Burton, I'm going to send our next question to you, and it is from Peter. He's asking if this project is in any way affected by the North Houston Highway Expansion Project.
So the CDBG-MIT project that we're talking about today is absolutely independent of the North Houston Highway Improvement Project. It's a standalone project. We would be sitting here with you tonight, even if TxDOT was not doing a project. with respect to the larger Subwatershed master plan for all of Little White Oak Bayou, we have coordinated quite a bit with TxDOT just so we understand each other. I use the term we're playing in the same sandbox, so we've got to figure out how to play together. And there are some things that interact between TxDOT and the flood control plan, but the CDBG-MIT project is 100% independent of the TxDOT plan.
Thank you, Burton. Alan, our next question is going to come to you, and it's from a Mrs. Wilson. She's asking if any projects on Buffalo will be affected.
So it's hard to, I'm going to try and interpret what you mean by affected. First, in regards to funding, the answer would be no, because the 30 million, for example, that I mentioned a minute ago, that is specific to the Little White Oak Bayou watershed project. And so funds will not be moved from one bond project to another. Where we say in the bond table that 30 million is good for Little White Oak, then it's going to stay with Little White Oak. Now, the other possible answer has to do with affecting projects in terms of the hydraulics. Well, we make a point of making sure that all of our projects complement each other. Now, Little White Oak does ultimately flow into White Oak, which then flows into Buffalo Bayou. We do have some projects down there right at the confluence with White Oak and Buffalo Bayou. You may have heard of the North Canal project. So the only affecting that this project may have on that would be that we would need to incorporate the modeling of this project and other projects to make sure that they truly do complement each other and don't contradict the benefits that each one of them are trying to produce. I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. Burton, I'm going to come to you for our next one, and it's from Mr. Fontenot. He wants to know how he can get a copy of the proposal that outlines what streets or addresses will be affected by this project.
I'd like to start out by saying that the application eventually, I believe, will be online for review, but we are at a feasibility planning level. So we haven't, to use this term, drilled down to the specifics of specific tracks and locations. That stuff will develop itself as we get into the pre-engineering and design level. We do anticipate that properties will be necessary. Most, if not all, flood control projects require some land. We've got to put the water that's in the yard, in the houses and streets somewhere, and that usually involves some land. And so we try to avoid private residences as much as we can. We like large tracts. We like, somebody said, crumbling and falling down buildings. We like those. We try to avoid homes. And so we're doing everything we can to do that, but we do not have any specific locations as of now.
Thanks, Burton. And I think that that's a great reminder that we are going a little bit out of our normal order with community engagement for this. We solicit community feedback throughout the project lifecycle, but since we do have this specific grant opportunity, we're coming to you for your feedback on this specific project and its inclusion in that grant application. And so that's really where we're focusing the conversation tonight, just as a reminder, but we're looking forward to continuing to address your questions. Alan, our next question is actually going to come to you, and it's from Mrs. DeBose. She's asking how this study will be integrated into the NNHIP and its commitment to fix historically flooded areas. She says they're planning to mitigate flooding, so why do you need to apply for these funds?
So NNHIP, of course, the North Highway Improvement Project, and the easiest way to explain that is that these efforts will complement each other. No, TxDOT's work will not completely address an issue, nor will ours, but together they'll get more bang for our buck, so to speak. So TxDOT's still working through their process. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with that. And what we wanted to do was to develop how the full watershed could be looked at and improvements made to that would, again, complement, but also stand alone. And that's an important element of this particular project application, is that it has to function and benefit residents stand alone. It can't be contingent upon some future work that TxDOT will do, however that ends up looking. And so really it's more along the lines of getting everybody together to do their part, and TxDOT's working to do their part, and we're working to our part. At the same time, in doing so, we want to bring some additional funds to that table to help build as much as possible.
Thanks, Alan. That's a great question and a great segue into a question that we received from Marcos M. And Alan, I'm going to stay with you for this one. He wants to know what residents and folks can do to help get this approved and to help us in our grant application.
So your feedback in this meeting is one of the main things that you can. So this process that we're going through, reaching out to the community, in addition to being the right thing to do, it's actually a requirement of the Texas General Land Office for these applications that we're submitting. And then we will summarize the outreach that we conducted and the sort of feedback that we received. And so you and others in your neighborhood that are simply responding to this saying, yes, we support this project, that will send a good message to the GLO that it's not just flood control saying this is a good thing to move forward with, but the community wants and supports this sort of effort. So participating in feedback and meetings like this are essential and actually will go a long way to helping get that word out there.
Thanks, Alan. And I think that's a great reminder just of the power of your input. I want to remind you that, building off of what Alan said, there are 3 ways for you to voice that input during tonight's session, but also moving forward. So you'll see a box next to the live stream on your screen where you're more than welcome to submit comments, questions, messages of support, whatever you choose. On the Flood Control District's website, also at hcfcd.org/Little White Oak. And if you're joining us via phone, you are still able to participate. Please press *3 to leave a message. Burton, I'm going to come back to you with another question from Marcos. He wants to know if this will help drains around the area.
It'll help a little bit. One of the issues with the lateral drainage and the storm drains and the general drainage is that it's difficult to drain to a flooded channel, and water tends to back up and everything gets stuck. It's like a big traffic jam. So in that context, yeah, it will help the drains in the area. But I must also say that the drains in the area are undersized, most of them are, and they'll still be undersized after this project's built. So that'll help them some, but it won't solve the fundamental problem, which is the drainage systems in this area and all parts of our area really are generally undersized.
Thanks, Burton. I'm going to stay with you for our next question, which is from Mr. Fontenot. He is asking if we've considered running the channel under the I-45 freeway.
Yeah, good question, Mr. Fontenot. We have. Not so much as part of development of this CDBG-MIT project, but in our larger watershed, subwatershed study that I talked about at the beginning, we looked at a lot of stuff. And in our meetings with TxDOT, we broached the subject. Look, if y'all are going to be building and rebuilding and reconstructing the freeway, maybe while you're out there, it'd be a good time to put a drainage conduit underneath it. And we looked at a few different alternatives and thoughts and plans. None of them worked as well as we hoped they would, and all of them cost quite a bit more than we wished they would. And we actually have found some better and more economical solutions that don't involve that. So we moved away from that concept, but it was given quite a hard look for quite a bit of time.
Thanks, Burton. It's always interesting to hear the background of what goes into these. While we're talking about the project that we're honing in on tonight, the specific one that will be included in the CDBG-MIT grant application, Burton, can you help us by clarifying the benefit area, the proposed benefit area? Lashendra is just asking for a little bit of clarification there.
Sure. I would describe the project area, or the area that would receive substantial benefits, game-changing type of benefits, is just as we showed here. If you follow the channel at the downstream end, you can see cross timbers just past Kennedy Elementary School, and then at the upper end is Tidwell, which is I believe there's a KIPP school up near there. That reach of the channel, which is about 8,000 feet, is an area where there's been quite a bit of flooding, and that's where the project features would be constructed, and that's where the substantial benefits would be realized.
Great. Thanks so much, Burton. I'm going to give you a quick break and throw one question over to Dina. Dina, John Jay is asking if there will be additional community outreach done by the Flood Control Project for these projects in the future. Alan and Burton touched on that a little bit, but I think it'd be great for you to just talk about that process.
Sure. There definitely will be some more community outreach in the future. So I'm going to say that there probably will be two types of community outreach. Early in the presentation, Burton talked about the larger master plan that we're working on for the Little White Oak Bayou watershed, and we will be conducting community outreach for that specifically, so we can share information with the folks throughout the watershed and share the information with them that we've learned and what the recommendations are that we have for the watershed, and to collect their input related to that. So that will all be coming in the future. But also, if we're successful in obtaining this CDBG-MIT grant, we'll also be conducting additional community outreach specific to this project that we're applying for the grant funding for. So residents in the watershed will definitely see us following up in the future to share more information with them.
Perfect. Thank you, Dina. Okay, Burton, I'm going to come back to you. Peter has joined us this evening and shared that he's noticed there tends to be a lot of flooding on the feeder road on Tidwell and 45 north and south. Is this project, the one that we're discussing this evening, supposed to also help reduce flooding on highway feeder roads?
Yeah, it seems like when we have big rains, you can always find a news crew on TV right there at Tidwell and 45. We're not targeting the feeder roads or the I-45 project with this project. That is something that presumptively TxDOT is looking at as part of their project. But generally speaking, as we reduce flooding along Little White Oak Bayou, the lateral systems that affect all the neighborhoods around there, we hope they get better. And you know what? That TxDOT system is also a lateral system as well. So there may be some residual benefits there and improvements, but we're not really targeting that. And I believe TxDOT will attempt to address that as they look at their project.
Helpful clarification. Thanks, Burton. We did get a comment from Sherry Ford, who let us know that she was having trouble viewing the presentation. I do just want to let everyone know, as a reminder, that a full recording of this presentation and tonight's conversation, as well as all the slides we're walking through, will be available on the Flood Control District's website. Again, that's hcfcd.org/Little White Oak. And those will be available from here forward. Burton, I'm going to come back to you. Suzanne asked, if this project goes through, but the culvert at 610 is not removed, will the flood risk in Independence Heights increase?
That's an excellent question, and I'm so glad you asked it. So one of the requirements of the grant, and one of the requirements of every flood control project, is that we don't move the flooding from one place to another place, or we don't solve flooding in one location on the backs of people in a different location. And particularly, we can get a lot of benefit through our project reach between Cross Timbers and Tidwell without the detention, with just by building the bigger channel. But in doing so, we would push more water downstream to Independence Heights. And so that is why we have quite a bit of detention in that project area as well to prevent that from happening. So that detention, in fact, will even provide some residual reduction. So if the TxDOT project never happens, and I know people talk about that, and the 610 culvert never gets taken out, no, flooding will not get worse. We do remove an opportunity to make it much better, but it will not get worse. I hope that answers your question, and that's kind of confusing.
I think that's helpful. Thanks, Burton. So our next question, I'm going to split between Alan and Burton. Throw you guys for a loop here. We have a caller asking, if this project moves forward, when will it be constructed? So Alan, I think it would be helpful for you to walk us through the grant timing, and then Burton, in turn, for you to walk us through the project specific timing. So Alan, over to you first.
Sure. So the first part of that answer has to do with the pace that the federal grant process moves. We mentioned earlier how it took 2.5 years after Congress appropriated the funds just to get where we are today. It should move a little bit quicker starting now. We expect that after the applications are submitted in late October, it'll probably take the GLO a couple of months to review and score all of the projects. Remember, they're going to have to score every single one of these projects. And the last time a large program opened up for applications, it was actually only a couple months ago. They had $700 million available, and they received $2.some-odd billion worth of applications. So I'm expecting the same thing will happen with the GLO as well. So they'll take a couple of months to review the project applications and then notify the winning agencies. That probably won't happen until sometime early next year. And so if I were guessing, and this is where I kick it over to Burton, is to say if I were to guess as to when we might be able to actually start with a successful grant and have the money in hand, it would probably be in the springtime of next year.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I started talking before my beat. Yeah, and the reason we showed this graphic, for those of y'all can see it, is we were trying to illustrate the things that must happen before we are, quote, moving dirt. And that is, we have to, deal with the utilities and right-of-way. We have to deal with environmental issues. We have to do a little, or actually a decent amount more study and refinement. Then we get into design, and that gets us up to construction. So from go time, if Alan says to us in March, let's just say, or April, he says, okay, we've received the grant, go. It'll take us 3 to 4 years of work before we are physically moving dirt and building this project.
Thanks, Burton. That's helpful. And thanks, Alan, as well. Dina, over to you. We had a question asking why we chose this part of the channel to target this project. Burton has spoken to that some, but do you mind reinforcing?
Sure. We chose this part of the channel for a couple of reasons. One is this is a part of the watershed that's experienced quite a bit of flooding in the past. So certainly we'd like to address that. And in addition to the severe flooding that's been experienced, flood control also owns quite a bit of right-of-way through this area, and we'd like to maximize the use of that.
Perfect. All right. Burton, our next question is going to come to you. A resident is commenting who is concerned about the 500 block of Tabor. It sounds like flooding is lateral and the storm drains cease to drain the street and houses flood. They suspect that the undercapacity of Little White Oak Bayou causes flooding. Can you speak to whether this project will aid in helping remediate some of that flooding?
If I'm not mistaken, I believe Tabor is further downstream near Main Street. I described reach 1, 2, and 3, and 4. It would be in reach 1. And that's quite a bit downstream of the CDBG-MIT project that we're talking about, which is really in the upper part of reach 2 and the lower part of reach 3. So there would be, small benefits, if any benefits at all, down there, to be frank. And so this project would not, manifest that far downstream. Now, it's a great time for me to make a plug for the larger watershed master plan that we talked about as well, and the future meetings that have not yet been scheduled or announced, because this is the area, amongst others, that we will specifically talk about. And we have been studying the Main Street trunk line system of recent, in fact. And there will be some interesting things to talk about regarding the cause and potential solutions down there. But it's not going to be benefited by the CDBG-MIT project we're discussing today.
Okay. And Burton, I'm going to stay with you for our next question. The mayor has requested that TxDOT alter their proposed project. Would that or any other alterations affect this proposed project?
Yes, we're aware that the mayor has requested that TxDOT minimize or actually avoid a larger footprint. And that would require some changes to things like lane width and things like that. It would not result in any changes to the larger drainage features that we are coordinating with them. So even if, for example, their project were to change in terms of lane width and right-of-way footprint, they would still remove the culvert at 610 and replace it with the bridge. So in that context, no, it doesn't affect us. As we're talking about the CDBG-MIT project here today, we are absolutely independent of TxDOT, and it doesn't affect us at all.
Thanks, Burton. That's really helpful clarification. And on the topic of the CDBG-MIT grant, Alan, a caller is asking how much money we're asking for this project and whether there's a chance we may get partial funding for this effort.
So the slide that illustrates that was just pulled up, and that is we are requesting a grant of $68 million, and we will add into that 10 million of our own. That'll be 10 million out of the 30 million that's been appropriated for the Little White Oak watershed in the bond program, for a total of $78 million. Is there a chance of partial funding? That's a good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. That would have to come from the General Land Office. But I will speculate and say that, let's just say for the sake of argument, they did. They said, hey, flood control, we don't have $68 million, but we do have $30 million. Well, of course, we're going to say we'll take it. But that also means that we'll have to re-envision this particular project because there's a balance between channel improvements and detention that has to be built to mitigate the channel improvements. And so what it'll result in is a potential scaling down of both the channel improvements and the detention basin to match up to the dollar amount that's being provided.
Thanks, Alan. And I'm going to stay with you for our last question of the evening. We had the same caller ask if any other agencies are competing for these same funds. But I'd actually like to broaden that question a little bit and just have you talk about the process that we're going through and the competition that we're facing, and really the importance of community engagement along the way. So over to you.
Sure. The short answer is yes. There are definitely other agencies competing for the same funds. When the federal government offers the state of Texas $4 billion and the GLO is responsible for rolling that money out, and they're doing so in the form of competitive applications, you can bet a bunch of people statewide are going to submit applications. And so there's only so much money that they're going to have. I know $2 billion or $4 billion sounds like a lot. They will likely receive more applications than they have funding for. And so we're hopeful. We feel confident that with good community support and a well written application, that will stand a good chance because one of the things that we continually remind the GLO and the Department of Housing and Urban Development about is that these funds would not be here were it not for those directly impacted by Hurricane Harvey. If Hurricane Harvey had not come and dropped 35 inches on average across the entire county and caused 150,000 people to flood, then the $4 billion would not have likely come to the state of Texas. And so were it not for our damages, the money would not exist. And so we continue to shout from the mountaintop that money needs to be spent here to help make this community more resilient.
Thanks, Alan. And with that, I just want to remind everyone, if you'd like to help us shout from that mountaintop, we do welcome your comments and your input on this application. Just as a quick final reminder, there are 3 ways to do that. Here on the page in front of you, if you're joining us online, on the Flood Control District's website, again, that URL is hcfcd.org/Little White Oak. And again, if you're joining us via phone this evening, before you depart, please press *3 and you can leave a message and let us know any feedback that you have on this effort. We do thank you all for joining us this evening, and welcome your continued engagement with this and other projects that are rolling out across the county. And we will, as all of our speakers tonight have mentioned, continue to come back to you and other communities across Harris County as these projects move forward. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.